My name's Dr. John Taggart, and I'm a lecturer at the School of Law at Queen's University Belfast. I'm delighted to be joined by Dr. Shona Minson, who is a barrister turned criminologist. Shona has most recently held a British Academy Fellowship at the Centre for Criminology at the University of Oxford. Shona, before we get on to your paper that you delivered at the Irish North-South Criminology Conference, can you give us a little bit of detail about your background and also your research interests?
Yes, thanks, John, for having me here. So originally I trained as a barrister. I did a law degree, and I then was called to the Bar of England and Wales and practiced from 1 King's Bench Walk in London for a number of years following pupillage. And my work was a mix of crime and family. So the set did a mix of the two, and as a pupil I did both. And then as my career progressed, I had a focus on family law and in particular care proceedings when the state were wanting to remove children from the care of their parents because of abuse, harm or neglect. I left because back in those days it was very difficult. I had children and there was no maternity leave or anything like that. It was all very difficult. And so as a self-employed barrister, it didn't work. And I left the bar for a period of time. And sometime later, having worked as a family mediator, I was looking at whether a research career might be something I could do or campaigning for a penal reform organisation. And I knew that I could do advocacy, but I didn't know anything about research. So I did a master's in criminology, criminal justice and social research methods. And it was during that time that I came across an issue which turned into my PhD, which was the fact that in the family courts, when you separate a parent from their child, when the state separates a parent from a child, the child is at the centre of the proceedings under the Children Act. Their welfare is the paramount consideration of the court. But in the criminal courts, when the state separates a parent from a child, when they send a parent to prison, nobody was asking if a child even existed. So that rang all sorts of alarm bells for me about how we could have in two different court forums a group of similar children being treated in completely different ways. It seemed to me like it was a discrimination point. And that became my PhD, looking at the maternal sentencing and the rights of children within that process. So I interviewed judges, I interviewed children whose mothers were in prison. And from that then did some work around talking to the judiciary. I made a series of films for judges, probation, lawyers, about what the parameters of their sentencing should be based on both case law and sentencing guidelines, and what the effects of children were that they should be adding into their weighing up process when they sentenced. So that was my PhD in a few years afterwards.
Thanks very much, Shona. So we're here at the Irish North-South Criminology Conference in Belfast, where you've just given a paper entitled Prison-Based or Adjacent Research from an Abolitionist Standpoint. I've had the benefit of hearing you present that, but the audience haven't. Could you tell us a little bit about the paper, Shona?
As I said this morning when I produced the paper, I feel like I'm sort of finding my way through this scape. People talk about as abolitionist reforms and reformist reforms, though I didn't know what those terms meant years ago. Abolitionist reforms are reforms that lead towards ultimate a decline in ease and imprisonment. No prison. Reformist reforms are those which reform the systems we have, but without that bigger aim.
And as I was undertaking work more recently, one of the projects I've been doing with the British Academy Fellowship was looking at access for mothers in prison who have got family justice proceedings going on. Access to justice. So are they able to take part in those proceedings? What are the barriers to participation? So again, a procedural justice kind of study. And what I became aware of was that my reason for doing that work was because I saw it as a consequence of maternal sentencing. And I'm really interested in courts and sentencing. So that's what I always come back to. And what I have been hoping to do through my research is provide more information for judges so that when they are sentencing a mother, they understand what the consequences of a sentence of imprisonment will be, both for the mother longer term and the children. And it seemed to me that this issue about whether a parent can be involved in their child's family court proceedings is really critical for children. So my standpoint on doing the work is because I want judges to be able to consider this properly, which may result in fewer women being sent to prison. But what I realised as I started to do the work was instead what it could be used for is to improve, for example, video suites in prisons so that people can take part in hearings remotely. It might improve the communication between courts and prisons about getting somebody on time. And that really wasn't my intention. So I started to be quite troubled really by the ethics of what I was doing and why I was doing it. And it's caused me that, so the paper really it was me talking through some of the research I've done and trying to look at what has been abolitionist in it and what has been reformist and where I would like to find a way through.
Now, you do adopt a very introspective perspective in the paper in relation to your own work and research and your background as a lawyer and as a researcher. Could you tell us a bit more about that perspective and writing in that way and how that maybe differs from perhaps more conventional academic styles of writing?
Yes. So when I entered academia, I honestly didn't know anything about it, really. I just saw this problem that I wanted to try and solve, and I went at it like a lawyer, where I tried to get the facts together, produce the evidence, make a case for it, and hope that there would be change, and realised somewhere along the way that academia doesn't always work like that. One of the things that I was very conscious of, though, as an early career researcher and a PhD student, was the emphasis on separating ourselves from our research, of being objective, being neutral, being a blank canvas, really, that you just go in. I did my research is all qualitative, so doing a lot of interviews where I gave nothing of myself and there was not that kind of personal interaction. What I realised after about 10 years of doing this research was that for various reasons, which I've talked about in other spaces and not for here, but was that actually research is really personal. And when we hear stories that are difficult and when people share things that they've maybe not talked to anyone else about, that has an impact on us. And we're doing this job as people. And so as I was trying to work my way through this abolitionist reform debate in my own head, I suppose it came back to it. It is very personal because what I have had to work out for myself are what are my principles in this? What do I think matters as Shona? And therefore, how can my work reflect my values? And so in terms of discussing it in a paper, the only place I had to go for reference really was my own experiences. And I also think that it's helpful maybe for other people when we are a bit more honest about what's going on, about the difficult ethical choices that we're feeling, about the cognitive dissonance that comes about when you're doing research, and how we navigate all of that. Because I don't think it exists outside of us. I don't think we can just read a paper and go, oh, that's the way I should do it. That's the academic standpoint on this. I think it does, it is personal at the end of the day. And so that's the approach I've taken in this.
Why should our listeners, in particular our student listeners, be interested in this debate around abolition? And also, if you could tell us a little bit more about the current state of that debate in 2024 as you see it.
So I think that we should all be interested in punishment, in how our societies punish people, because it's representing us. It's about how we think society will best function. It is about our members of society. And if you get to a point where you are earning and you pay taxes, you're paying for it as well. So I think punishment is something we should all be really aware of and understand. And the abolitionist debate, I was talking to somebody over lunch about how they felt very uncomfortable with applying that label to themselves, saying I'm abolitionist. And I completely understand that, because I think for a long time, people have thought abolitionists, they are absolutely anti the police, anti prisons, getting rid of everything. And people struggle with that, as people often do with absolutes. And what I have come to realise in the last few years as I've been working through this is actually there's a spectrum and a journey towards abolition that I certainly feel very comfortable placing myself somewhere on that spectrum. I don't have all the answers, I don't understand it all, but what I can see is that prison is not doing what people think prison should do. So it does not rehabilitate. It does not send people back into the world in a better state than they were when they went into prison. We have got decades of research evidence that says it's a costly way of doing harm to people for the most part. It does remove people from society, but in most cases only temporarily. So it's not really providing the service we think it should do. It's costing a lot of money. Prisons in Ireland and in England and Wales are way overcrowded. Way overcrowded is not a good way of putting it, but they are very overcrowded. It's a problem. And something has to change. So that's why I think your students should be interested in this, because actually, if punishment needs to change in some way, then we need to start interrogating imprisonment, why we do it, what the alternatives are, how we move from overuse of one system to using another, because of course that's the really tricky part. There are lots of people who will say, yes, I think we should send fewer people to prison. You say, well, how are we going to do that? What are the systems for change? We don't know. And so I think we need as many people thinking about this as possible so that we can get a range of ideas and thoughts and a general pressure in a direction of saying, we're doing something really a bit stupid here. We keep overusing a system that we know does not work. Time to think about something different.
And how do you see your own research in this area developing, Shona?
Well, I'm just coming to the end of this family justice project. And I suppose what I'm hoping that that's going to actually make some difference to the way family courts run things. I'm hoping the family judges that I've talked to were quite appalled by what I told them was going on. And they want to feed back to the criminal judges to say, hang on, why are you putting these people in prison when then there are these consequences? So some of that might happen. In terms of my own work, I think what I've realised I am most interested in is working out what the levers for change are across the systems and how do we pull them. Because I think a lot of people can see better ways of doing things, but what we haven't quite understood is how we activate those. So I think my work will continue to be within women's justice, but I'm not entirely sure what direction that's going to go in. I'm really fascinated by problem-solving courts at the moment and actually looking at South American models of those, which I think are quite far advanced in terms of what we do here in the UK. So that's the next thing that I will be looking at.
Shona, I'd like to finish off by quoting back something that you quoted in your paper today and then ask you a question about it. It's a quote from Dr. Sarah Lamble, who's a reader in criminology and queer theory at the School of Law at Birkbeck in London. And for the benefit of our listeners, here's the quote in full. A key question to consider is not only whether a proposed reform will reduce harm and suffering, but whether it simultaneously works to reduce the size, scope, and power of the system. Does it challenge the assumptions that underpin and sustain the system? Does the reform directly link to a wider vision of change that will reduce our reliance on prisons? Now, I know you quoted that quote from Dr. Lamble in your paper specifically in relation to prison reform and abolitionism.
Yes.
But what more general resonance do you think that might have for any researcher?
I think that's a really great question to ask. I think for any researcher, it is helpful to understand your own position and what it is you're hoping to do with the research. Now, you might not have that right at the start, but it will probably develop. And certainly, we're in an era where we talk about impact a lot. So when you're thinking about research impact, to decide what direction things should go in. And I think that as individuals, for a lot of people working in criminal justice, what they are wanting to do is reduce harm and suffering. I was thinking, what is it that motivates me to do this? And I really hate injustice. And I think that's why I was a lawyer as well. That's what I got wound up by. I wanted to be in a situation where I address. And a lot of people, there will be other reasons why you do it. But I think to understand in what you're doing, what its impacts might be beyond the most direct and obvious. And so, for example, with my family justice work, I hope that if there is reform because of that, if there is, say, a practice direction in the family court, I hope that will reduce harm and suffering, because I hope that means cases will be managed better and women will not be left sitting in their cell when they should be in court and thinking, I haven't been able to have anything to do in this system, whether it simultaneously works to reduce the size, scope and power of the system. Well, I would hope that with mine, it would feed back into criminal sentencing where they understand that maybe this is an issue. And so if someone's got family court proceedings, or if that's going to come about because a woman goes to prison, that might be a reason not to put someone in prison. Challenging assumptions. My work touches on stigma and stigmatization of women who are in prison. And those are, of course, sustaining the system, those kind of stigmas, and I hope might break down some of that. And the wider vision of change, reducing our reliance in prisons, is sort of questioning the way the whole system works. But I think you're absolutely right, John, that could be applied to non-carceral issues, to whatever system it is that somebody is engaged with, to ask those kinds of questions, change a few of the words, but certainly to think, what is the wider vision of change that you're looking to influence? And does your work go along with that, or is it actually going to get in the way of that?
Shona, thanks for your time today.
Thanks for having me.